From the moment the words "winter is coming" were first uttered, the world became hooked on HBO's Game of Thrones, and ever since then the series has been consistently impressing us, slowly building up its world to facilitate the story. But what exactly is that story? As the show's progressed, the overarching plot has become more defined, to the point where IMDb even had to change its short synopsis. And who can really blame them? There's so much going on in the world of Game of Thrones that it's hard to really pinpoint an exact plot. It traverses across an entire world, across 2 fictional continents, dealing with politics and religion and dragons and magic and zombies, but it takes a special skill to be able to properly tell a story of this scope. If the audience was suddenly launched into situations with several characters and places and abilities that haven't been properly introduced, no one would have any idea what's going on. This doesn't happen though, because Game of Thrones has mastered slow implementation, the art of restraint. A perfect example of this would be the show's approach to magic. In the very first scene of the series, we see a small glimpse of magic north of the wall, but other than that, there is no magic for the entire first season. No White Walkers, no dragons, no shape-shifting or conjuring. Because of this, as well as everyone's constant denial, we begin to doubt that magic even exists.
You don't believe that nonsense.
Other than that first scene, there's pretty much nothing that would really indicate otherwise. The only supernatural thing we see for the rest of the season occurs within a dream, and because of this, the final scene of Season 1 was mind-blowing as audiences were awestruck upon realizing that dragons were real. This opened the door to a world of endless possibilities, but this door also led to more potential for failure. Once magic is introduced in a show, it's easy to get carried away and have all sorts of crazy things happen just because they can. But Game of Thrones remains grounded. Once Season 2 begins, we're convinced that the only magic in this world is dragons and White Walkers, that no human can perform magic. We see magic rituals that reap no rewards, which exacerbates this doubt, and then out of nowhere. This show waited a season and a half, 14 hours of television to establish that magic existed, and from there, it took its sweet time to escalate. Once again, a lazier show would suddenly have every character start to use magic, or explain at the very beginning the rules of this magic, which would require a lot of exposition and is really just not an interesting way of incorporating the supernatural into a story. In Game of Thrones, though, we're given no rules or limitations, as no regular Westerosi really knows the boundaries, but we know nobody's overpowered because the magic is so scarce and only occurs in necessary situations. This prevents desensitization and allows us to be awed by magic every time it's used. And as the show reaches its climactic seasons, the magic is also beginning to climax. Imagine going from Ned Stark dueling Jaime Lannister in one episode to a bunch of magical creatures protecting a magical tree from ice zombies while someone inside mentally travels back in time in order to learn everything about the universe. This would be absurd in Season 1, and in The Walking Dead, it wouldn't even be thrilling. But since it's been built up slowly, it makes sense, and due to the restraint, we're still shocked by what happens. Another way the show's restraint works is with audience satisfaction, preventing what we want to happen in order for it to be more satisfying when it finally does later on. Take Joffrey, for example. Throughout the entire first season, Joffrey was an awful person, to say the absolute least. We see a lot of emotional development that gives us an understanding of why he is the way he is, but once that's out of the way, he just does awful things to a degree that's made him one of the most genuinely despised characters ever put on paper, film, or stage. As the show progresses, we see a few instances where he could die, but he doesn't. And every minute longer he lives, the more frustrated the audience becomes. Every time he opens his mouth, we just want to smash his teeth in. Finally, after 3 full seasons pass, the perfect moment arises for him to get what he deserves. It's the happiest day of his life, and he's even more of a little shit than usual, and he finally reaches his peak. Never has the audience hated him more. And then finally, release. Had he died in Season 1, we wouldn't have had time for our loathing to brew, for our desire to increase. As a result, our satisfaction upon his death would have a proportional lack of satisfaction. I mentioned The Walking Dead again because that show suffers from a lack of restraint. Too often does it introduce us to a character and spend about just enough time to develop him and his conflicts before killing him off. There's no brew time. Our desire has only just developed before being satisfied, if you could even call it that. These two shows actually have a lot to compare. Where The Walking Dead separates its characters for half a season, Game of Thrones separates them for the rest of the show. It would have been great in Season 3 had Arya been reunited with Robb, or Bran with Jon, but the fact that they were both interrupted merely frustrated us more, caused us to crave their reunion. Where The Walking Dead gives us characters with interesting abilities, Game of Thrones shows these characters working toward their abilities, struggling to succeed over and over until they finally get it right, instilling in the audience a legitimate sense of accomplishment. It would have been cool if Arya could suddenly shapeshift and Bran could instantly warg, but since we saw them practice, saw them struggle, it became far more satisfying to watch them finally use their abilities. It's as though the show rewards its audience for sticking through the anticipation. Think of it as taking time to taste each individual sip of wine as opposed to chugging, and The Walking Dead just pours the wine down our throats. It's the kid whose parents bought him a Porsche for his 16th birthday, whereas Game of Thrones is the kid who worked 2 jobs in order to buy a beat-up car before repairing it on his own. Think of it as some weird sex metaphor. The more Game of Thrones teases its audience, the more satisfaction the audience will feel. It's a shame that more shows can't master the art of restraint the way Game of Thrones can, especially since its pacing is overshadowed by how awesome everything is. Showrunners think that the more awesome they can put in their show, the better they can make it, but it's really the scarcity of awesome that makes it, well, awesome. Game of Thrones has done a lot right, but what's made it all work is the exploitation of our desire. And that says a lot about human nature. We all want what we want, and we can't help that. We're selfish and impatient, and we need a reward in order to work. Maybe I'm looking too much into this, but it would simply be incorrect to say that we're not disappointed, or at least uncomfortable, when we're not given what we want or what's expected. So if you ever want to manipulate someone, set something up and leave them hanging for far too long before finally rewarding them. It's only after this lingering time that a conclusion can finally give your audience their well-deserved satisfaction. Thank you.